Welcome. Before the images unfold and the timelines appear, we invite you to step into one of the most haunting corridors of the 20th century, a period when ideology hardened into policy and prejudice was engineered into persecution. Between 1933 and 1945, under the rule of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime, Europe witnessed the systematic attempt to eradicate the Jewish people, a tragedy later known as the Holocaust. 6 million lives were extinguished, yet millions of stories remain. Diaries hidden in attics, letters never delivered, names carved into fading stone. Figures like Anne Frank wrote of hope from behind sealed windows, while others like Oskar Schindler risked everything to defy the tide. Trains ran on time, factories produced relentlessly, and ordinary streets concealed extraordinary cruelty. This is not only a history of destruction, but a warning etched into humanity's memory, a reminder that ideas, when left unchallenged, can become instruments of unimaginable consequence. When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent on the 11th of November 1918, Germany did not simply lose a war, it lost its sense of identity. The Kaiser abdicated, the empire collapsed overnight, and millions of soldiers returned home to a country they barely recognized. Inflation was beginning its catastrophic spiral, food shortages plagued the cities, and the streets of Berlin and Munich were torn between communist revolutionaries and right-wing paramilitaries vying for control of the nation's future. Into this chaos walked a thin, unremarkable 29-year-old Austrian with a toothbrush mustache, a bitter sense of personal failure, and an unshakable conviction that someone must be to blame for Germany's humiliation. His name was Adolf Hitler, and within 15 years he would channel the resentment of a broken nation into the most destructive ideology the modern world has ever known. To understand how Hitler's anti-Semitism became the engine of a genocidal state, one must first understand the Germany he stepped into after the war. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed crushing reparations on Germany, stripped it of territory, and most psychologically damaging of all, forced the nation to accept sole responsibility for causing the conflict. For millions of Germans, this was not justice but betrayal. A powerful myth took hold almost immediately, the Dolchstoßlegende, or stab-in-the-back legend, which claimed that Germany's army had never truly been defeated on the battlefield, but had been undermined from within by traitors on the home front: socialists, communists, and above all, Jews. This conspiracy theory, promoted by prominent military figures including General Erich Ludendorff, gave the German far right a narrative that was as simple as it was poisonous. The nation had not failed, it had been sabotaged. And the saboteurs, they claimed, had names and addresses. Anti-Semitism, of course, did not begin in the beer halls of post-war Munich. It was one of Europe's oldest and most deeply embedded prejudices, stretching back centuries through waves of religious persecution, forced expulsions, and social exclusion. Jews had been blamed for the Black Death in the 14th century, confined to ghettos across the continent, and subjected to pogroms in the Russian Empire that drove millions to emigrate in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the German-speaking world, specifically, a newer and more insidious strain of anti-Semitism had emerged in the decades before World War I, one rooted not in religion, but in pseudoscientific racial theory. Writers like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, a British-born Germanophile, whose 1899 book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, argued that history was fundamentally a struggle between racial groups, provided intellectual respectability to the idea that Jews were not merely a religious minority, but a biologically distinct and inherently dangerous race. Chamberlain's work was widely read in educated German circles and deeply admired by Kaiser Wilhelm II himself. It laid the groundwork for a worldview in which anti-Semitism was not a matter of personal bigotry, but a supposedly rational response to a biological threat. Hitler absorbed these ideas during his formative years in Vienna, where he lived as a struggling artist between 1908 and 1913. The Vienna of that era was a cauldron of ethnic tensions and political extremism, home to figures like Karl Lueger, the city's openly anti-Semitic mayor, and Georg Ritter von Schönerer, a pan-German nationalist who advocated for the exclusion of Jews from public life. Whether Hitler's anti-Semitism crystallized during his Vienna years or later, as some historians suggest, is a matter of ongoing debate. In Mein Kampf, he would dramatically describe an encounter with an Orthodox Jew on a Vienna street as a moment of awakening. "Is this a Jew?" He claimed to have asked himself, followed by, "Is this a German?" Though the passage reads more like ideological mythology than honest autobiography. What is beyond dispute is that by the time Hitler returned to Munich after the war and began his political career, anti-Semitism was not simply one of his beliefs. It was the lens through which he interpreted everything. Hitler's entry into politics was almost accidental. In September 1919, still technically a soldier, he was sent by the German Army's intelligence division to observe a small, obscure gathering called the German Workers' Party, or DAP. Instead of merely reporting on the meeting, he joined the party, quickly discovering that he possessed an extraordinary talent for public speaking. His early speeches at Munich beer halls were electrifying not because of their intellectual content, which was crude and conspiratorial, but because of their emotional intensity. He spoke of Germany's humiliation, of the Versailles Diktat, of Marxist subversion and Jewish treachery, and he delivered it all with a theatrical fury that audiences found mesmerizing. By 1920, the party had been renamed the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the NSDAP, or Nazi Party, and Hitler was rapidly becoming its most powerful voice. The party's 25-point program, announced in February 1920, explicitly called for the revocation of Jewish citizenship rights, the expulsion of Jews who had immigrated since 1914, and the exclusion of Jews from public office and the press. Anti-Semitism was not an afterthought in the Nazi platform. It was there from the very first page. Hitler's failed attempt to seize power in the Munich beer hall putsch of November 1923 landed him in Landsberg prison, where he spent 9 months in relatively comfortable confinement and used the time to dictate what would become his ideological manifesto, Mein Kampf, published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926. The book is rambling, repetitive, and at times nearly incoherent, yet it laid out with disturbing clarity the ideas that would later drive Nazi policy. At its core, Mein Kampf presented a vision of history as an eternal racial struggle in which the Aryan race, a term Hitler used loosely to describe Germanic and Northern European peoples, was locked in a fight for survival. Against forces of racial corruption and decline, Jews occupied the center of this paranoid worldview, described not merely as an inferior group, but as an active, parasitic force working to undermine Aryan civilization from within. Hitler depicted Jews simultaneously as the secret puppet masters behind both international capitalism and Soviet communism, a contradiction that mattered little in the logic of conspiracy. "The personification of the devil as the symbol of all evil," he wrote, "assumes the living shape of the Jew." The book also introduced the concept of Lebensraum, or living space, arguing that the German people needed to expand eastward into Slavic territories to secure land and resources for future generations. This idea, fusing racial supremacy with territorial ambition, would eventually fuel both the invasion of the Soviet Union and the genocide that accompanied it. What transformed these fringe ideas into a mass movement was not merely Hitler's charisma, but a sophisticated and relentless propaganda apparatus. Joseph Goebbels, who became the Nazi Party's head of propaganda in 1929, and later the Reich Minister of Propaganda after 1933, understood better than almost anyone in the 20th century how to manipulate public emotion through media. Nazi propaganda did not rely solely on crude caricatures of Jewish people, though those certainly existed. most notoriously in Julius Streicher's vulgar newspaper Der Stürmer, but on a comprehensive strategy that saturated every aspect of German cultural life. Films like The Eternal Jew, released in 1940, presented dehumanizing imagery of Jewish communities in occupied Poland, alongside fabricated claims about Jewish domination of global finance and culture. Radio broadcasts, posters, school textbooks, and even children's games carried anti-Semitic messaging. The regime understood a fundamental truth about propaganda. A lie repeated often enough, from enough directions, begins to feel like common sense. Racial theory provided the pseudoscientific scaffolding on which this propaganda rested. The Nazis drew heavily on the eugenics movement, which had enjoyed mainstream respectability in both Europe and the United States during the early 20th century. They elevated racial classification to a matter of state policy, establishing elaborate bureaucratic systems to determine who qualified as Aryan and who did not. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 codified this racial worldview into law, stripping Jews of German citizenship and prohibiting marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. These laws did not emerge from popular demand, but were imposed from above, yet they were met with widespread compliance and, in many quarters, active enthusiasm. This is perhaps the most unsettling dimension of the story. The ideology did not simply descend from Hitler onto a reluctant population. It resonated because the cultural soil had been prepared over centuries, fertilized by religious prejudice, enriched by pseudoscience, and watered by the economic despair and national humiliation of the post-war years. Nationalism, too, played a critical role in making anti-Semitism palatable to millions who might never have considered themselves hateful. The Nazi vision of national identity was defined not by civic belonging, but by blood. To be German, in the Nazi framework, was not a matter of language, residency, or loyalty. It was a matter of race. This meant that Jews, no matter how deeply rooted in German culture, no matter how many had served and died in the German army during World War I, were by definition outsiders. The nationalist fervor whipped up by the regime created a psychological environment in which excluding, dehumanizing, and ultimately destroying an entire group of people could be framed not as cruelty, but as patriotism. Hitler himself articulated this with chilling directness in a speech to the Reichstag on the 30th of January 1939, the 6th anniversary of his rise to power. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. It was a statement made in public, recorded on film, and broadcast to millions. The world heard it and, for the most part, chose not to believe it. By the time war broke out in September 1939, the ideological architecture for genocide was fully in place. What remained was the opportunity, and the war itself would provide it, transforming what had been a program of legal persecution and forced emigration into the industrial machinery of mass murder that the world would come to know as the Holocaust. The hatred had deep roots, but it was the deliberate, methodical cultivation of that hatred by a modern state, using every tool of technology, law, and communication at its disposal, that made the unthinkable not only possible but, for millions of ordinary people, acceptable. On the evening of the 30th of January, 1933, torchlight parades wound through the streets of Berlin as thousands of Nazi supporters celebrated the moment Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. The appointment was not the result of a revolution or a military coup. It was the product of backroom political negotiations carried out by conservative elites who believed they could control the former beer hall agitator and use his popular support to stabilize a fractured republic. Franz von Papen, the aristocratic politician who helped broker the deal, reportedly assured his colleagues with a phrase that would become one of history's great miscalculations. Within 2 months, We will have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll squeak. Instead, within 2 months, Hitler had begun dismantling the foundations of German democracy, and within a year, the machinery of a totalitarian state was nearly complete. The speed of the Nazi consolidation of power remains one of the most striking features of this period. On the 27th of February 1933, barely 4 weeks after Hitler's appointment, the Reichstag building home of the German parliament was set ablaze. The Nazis blamed the fire on a communist conspiracy and used it as a pretext to issue the Reichstag fire decree the following day, suspending fundamental civil liberties including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to assembly. Thousands of political opponents, particularly communists and social democrats, were arrested in the days that followed. Then, on March 23, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which effectively granted Hitler the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. Democracy did not die in Germany with a dramatic final battle. It was dismantled piece by piece through legal mechanisms wielded by men in suits who understood the power of procedural language. By July 1933, all political parties other than the NSDAP had been banned, independent trade unions dissolved, and the German press brought under state supervision. The one-party state was a reality, and the path was clear for ideology to become policy. For Germany's approximately 525,000 Jews, less than 1% of the total population, the consequences were immediate and devastating. On the 1st of April 1933, the Nazi regime organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, the first large-scale, state-directed act of anti-Semitic persecution. SA stormtroopers stood menacingly outside Jewish shops, law offices and medical practices, holding signs that read, Deutsche, wehrt euch, kauft nicht bei Juden. Germans, defend yourselves, don't buy from Jews. The boycott was officially limited to a single day, partly because of international backlash, and partly because many German consumers ignored it. But its symbolic significance was enormous. It announced, in the most public way possible, that the Jewish population was no longer under the protection of the state. Within a week, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was enacted on April 7th, barring Jews, along with political opponents, from government employment. Doctors, lawyers, professors, and judges who had served the German state for decades suddenly found themselves dismissed from their positions. The so-called Aryan paragraph, embedded in this and subsequent laws, required proof of non-Jewish ancestry as a condition of employment, turning genealogy into a matter of survival. What followed over the next several years was an avalanche of discriminatory legislation so comprehensive that historians have documented over 400 individual laws and decrees targeting Jews between 1933 and 1939. Jews were banned from serving in the military, excluded from universities, forbidden from owning farmland, barred from public parks and swimming pools, and stripped of professional licenses. The Nuremberg Laws, announced at the annual Nazi Party rally in September 1935, formalized racial exclusion at the most fundamental level. The Reich citizenship law declared that only those of German or related blood could be citizens of the Reich, reducing Jews to the status of subjects with no political rights. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor prohibited marriages and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jewish Germans, criminalizing intimacy itself. The laws required elaborate racial classifications distinguishing between full Jews, half Jews, and quarter Jews that entangled millions of lives in a grotesque, bureaucratic web. A person's fate could hinge on the religion of a single grandparent. Propaganda played a central role in making this escalating persecution not only tolerable, but seemingly justified to the broader population. Joseph Goebbels, appointed Reich Minister of Propaganda in March 1933, built a communications empire that controlled virtually every channel of information and culture in Germany. Newspapers that did not align with the regime were shut down or taken over. Editors received daily instructions from the propaganda ministry about which stories to publish and how to frame them. Radio, which Goebbels considered the most powerful propaganda tool of the era, was made widely accessible through the production of affordable people's receivers, the Volksempfänger that brought Hitler's speeches and regime messaging into millions of German homes. Cinema became another weapon. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, documenting the 1934 Nuremberg Rally, presented the Nazi movement as a transcendent national awakening, while later films like The Eternal Jew depicted Jewish people through dehumanizing imagery designed to provoke disgust and fear. In schools, children were taught anti-Semitic ideology from textbooks approved by the regime, solving math problems that calculated the cost of caring for the mentally ill or measuring skull shapes to learn about racial science. Julius Streicher's weekly newspaper Der Stürmer, with its vulgar caricatures and fabricated stories of Jewish criminality, was displayed in public showcases across the country, ensuring that even those who did not subscribe could not escape its messaging. The cumulative effect of this propaganda saturation was profound. It normalized hatred, reframed persecution as self-defense, and gradually eroded the moral inhibitions that might have otherwise restrained ordinary citizens from participating in or acquiescing to the regime's crimes. Social exclusion operated in tandem with legal discrimination, creating an environment in which Jewish Germans were progressively isolated from every aspect of public and private life. Former friends stopped visiting. Neighbors turned away. Children were bullied out of schools before laws formally expelled them. Jewish musicians were banned from performing in German orchestras, Jewish actors removed from stages, Jewish authors purged from libraries. On the 10th of May, 1933, university students across Germany, in Berlin, Munich, Heidelberg, and dozens of other cities, gathered to burn tens of thousands of books written by Jewish, socialist, and other un-German authors. The flames consumed works by Heinrich Heine, Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, Albert Einstein, and many others. Standing before the bonfire in Berlin's Opernplatz, Goebbels declared, "The era of extreme Jewish intellectualism is now at an end." It was a bitter irony that Heine himself, a century earlier, had written a line that now seemed prophetic. Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people also. The violence that accompanied this social and legal persecution was not random but strategically deployed and escalated over time. While individual acts of brutality against Jewish citizens occurred throughout the 1930s beatings, public humiliations, vandalism, the regime periodically orchestrated larger demonstrations of organized violence to test public reaction and push the boundaries of what was acceptable. The most devastating of these before the war was the pogrom of November 9–10, 1938, known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Triggered by the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by Herschel Greenspan, a 17-year-old Polish-Jewish refugee whose parents had been among thousands of Jews forcibly deported from Germany to the Polish border in dire conditions. The pogrom was presented by the regime as a spontaneous eruption of popular anger. In reality, it was carefully coordinated by Goebbels and the SA leadership. Over the course of 2 nights, more than 1,400 synagogues were set ablaze across Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Approximately 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps at Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. At least 91 Jews were killed, though the actual number was almost certainly higher. In a final act of calculated cruelty, the regime then imposed a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community, forcing the victims to pay for the destruction inflicted upon them. Kristallnacht shattered any remaining illusion that Jewish life in Germany could continue. Emigration, which had already been underway since 1933, became desperate. By 1939, roughly half of Germany's pre-war Jewish population had fled the country. Those who could obtain visas, afford passage, and find nations willing to accept them, which was far from guaranteed. The Evian Conference of July 1938, convened to address the refugee crisis, had ended in bitter failure when country after country, including the United States, Canada, and Australia, refused to significantly raise their immigration quotas. The Dominican Republic was the only nation to offer a concrete commitment to accept refugees. For those who remained, the walls were closing in. The outbreak of war in September 1939 transformed the nature and scale of persecution dramatically. As German forces conquered Poland, they brought under their control roughly 2 million Polish Jews, a population far larger than Germany's own pre-war Jewish community. The regime's response was to concentrate this population into ghettos, sealed urban districts where Jews were forced to live in conditions of extreme overcrowding, starvation, and disease. The Warsaw Ghetto, established in November 1940, crammed approximately 400,000 people into an area of just 4 square kilometers, roughly 30% of the city's population confined to 4% of its area. The Łódź Ghetto, sealed in April 1940, held over 160,000 people. Conditions inside were catastrophic. Daily food rations in the Warsaw Ghetto averaged around 184 calories per person, a fraction of what the human body requires to survive. Typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery spread rapidly. Bodies appeared on the streets each morning, sometimes covered with newspapers by passers-by who had no other means of offering dignity to the dead. Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian trapped inside the Warsaw Ghetto, organized a secret archive known by its code name Oyneg Shabes, Joy of the Sabbath, in which dozens of contributors documented daily life, collected official decrees, preserved personal diaries, and recorded testimonies. The archive, buried in milk cans and metal boxes, was partially recovered after the war and remains one of the most important primary sources of the Holocaust. The ghettos were designed not as permanent arrangements but as holding pens, though many Nazi officials did not yet know or had not yet decided what the next step would be. Forced emigration, once the regime's preferred method of ridding Germany of its Jewish population, became increasingly impractical as the war expanded and fewer destinations remained accessible. The Madagascar Plan, a bizarre 1,940 proposal to deport 4 million European Jews to the island off the coast of Africa, was discussed with apparent seriousness before being abandoned as logistically impossible given British naval control of the seas. Meanwhile, the first concentration camps, Dachau, opened in March 1933, followed by Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and others had been operating for years, initially targeting political opponents, but gradually expanding to imprison Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and anyone deemed a threat to the racial or political order. These camps were sites of forced labor, torture, and death, though they had not yet been converted into the industrialized killing centers they would later become. The system was evolving, each phase of persecution building logically upon the last, each act of violence normalizing the next, each bureaucratic measure tightening the noose a little further, until, by the summer of 1941, the regime had both the ideological conviction and the institutional infrastructure to take the final, irreversible step from persecution to extermination. On the 20th of January 1942, 15 senior Nazi officials gathered in a stately villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, just outside Berlin. They sipped cognac, reviewed typed documents, and over the course of roughly 90 minutes, coordinated the logistical framework for the systematic murder of 11 million European Jews. The meeting was not where the decision to commit genocide was made. That process had been unfolding for months through a web of verbal orders, regional initiatives, and ideological escalation. But the Wannsee Conference represents something uniquely chilling in human history. Bureaucracy, placed in the service of annihilation. The minutes of the meeting, preserved by a single surviving copy discovered after the war, read less like a blueprint for mass murder and more like the agenda of a corporate planning session. Departments were assigned roles. Timetables were discussed. SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, who chaired the meeting, spoke of the final solution to the Jewish question in the same measured tone one might use to discuss railway schedules, and indeed, railway schedules would become one of the regime's most critical tools of death. The Holocaust did not emerge as a single decree signed on a single day. It evolved through a process historians sometimes call cumulative radicalization, in which local commanders, party ideologues, and central authorities pushed one another toward ever more extreme measures. The Einsatzgruppen mobile killing squads, operating behind the advancing German front lines in the Soviet Union, had already murdered over 1 million Jews by the end of 1941, executing men, women, and children in mass shootings at ravines and forest clearings. The massacre at Babi Yar, near Kiev, saw 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children shot over just 2 days in September 1941. But the Nazi leadership soon recognized that bullets were inefficient and psychologically damaging even to the perpetrators. They sought something more industrial, more detached, more scalable. That search produced the extermination camps. Unlike concentration camps, which had existed since 1933 primarily as sites of detention and forced labor, the extermination camps built in occupied Poland, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek, were engineered with a singular purpose. Treblinka, for example, operated with a permanent staff of only about 30 SS officers and around 120 Ukrainian auxiliaries. Yet between July 1942 and October 1943, approximately 900,000 people were murdered there. The process was designed for speed. Deportees arrived by train, were separated from their belongings, herded into gas chambers disguised as showers, and killed within hours of arrival. Their bodies were then burned, and the next transport was already on its way. The deportations themselves constituted an enormous logistical operation that implicated thousands of officials across occupied Europe. Jews from France, the Netherlands, Greece, Hungary, and dozens of other territories were rounded up, packed into cattle cars, and transported across the continent. In Hungary alone, between May and July 1944, more than 437,000 Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in just 56 days, a pace that required the active coordination of Hungarian authorities, German SS officers, and the Reich railway system. Adolf Eichmann, the mid-ranking SS officer who managed much of this logistical machinery, would later become one of the most recognized faces of what the philosopher Hannah Arendt famously called the banality of evil, the capacity of ordinary bureaucrats to facilitate extraordinary horror without ever feeling personally responsible. Inside the camps, life was a daily negotiation with death. Prisoners endured starvation, disease, forced labor in munitions, factories and quarries, medical experiments, and random acts of violence. Primo Levi, an Italian Jewish chemist who survived Auschwitz, later wrote, "Here there is no why." His memoir, If This Is a Man, became one of the most powerful literary testimonies of the 20th century, capturing not just the physical brutality of the camp, but the deliberate destruction of human dignity that preceded physical death. Elie Wiesel, who was 15 when he arrived at Auschwitz with his family, described in Night the moment he watched his father waste away and die, and with him, something irretrievable within himself. These accounts, and thousands of others gathered in the decades since, form an archive of suffering that no statistical summary can capture. 6 million Jews were murdered. Behind that number stand 6 million individual lives, each with a name, a family, a language, a trade, a prayer, a half-finished letter. And yet, even within the camps, resistance persisted. In October 1943, prisoners at Sobibor staged an armed uprising, killing several SS guards and breaching the camp's perimeter. Roughly 300 inmates escaped, though many were later recaptured and killed. A similar revolt erupted at Treblinka in August 1943. At Auschwitz-Birkenau in October 1944, members of the Sonderkommando Jewish prisoners forced to operate. The crematoria used smuggled explosives to destroy Crematorium 4. In the ghettos, resistance took both armed and unarmed forms. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943, led by young fighters under Mordechai Anielewicz, held off German forces for nearly a month, becoming one of the most symbolic acts of Jewish defiance during the war. Resistance also took quieter forms: the keeping of hidden diaries, the smuggling of food, the teaching of children in secret schools, the preservation of religious rituals in the face of a regime that sought to erase an entire people from the earth. Liberation came in stages. Soviet forces reached Majdanek in July 1944, making it the first major extermination camp to be discovered by the Allies. When British troops entered Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, they encountered roughly 60,000 emaciated prisoners and over 13,000 unburied corpses. The footage captured by Allied cameramen at Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz shocked the world and became seared into public memory. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, upon visiting the Ohrdruf camp in Germany, insisted that as many American soldiers and journalists as possible witness the conditions firsthand. "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," Eisenhower reportedly said. "Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." The liberation of the camps did not mean the end of suffering. Thousands of survivors died in the weeks following liberation, their bodies too damaged by starvation and disease to recover. Those who survived faced the monumental task of rebuilding their lives in a world where their communities, families, and homes had been obliterated. Many spent years in displaced persons camps across Europe, waiting for countries willing to accept them. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was, for many survivors, both a political event and a deeply personal act of collective renewal, though it carried its own complexities and consequences that continue to reverberate. The pursuit of justice after the war reshaped international law in ways that still define the global legal order. The Nuremberg trials, held between November 1945 and October 1946, prosecuted 22 major Nazi leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and a newly codified category, crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, individuals were held personally accountable under international law for state-sponsored atrocities. 12 defendants were sentenced to death, including Hermann Göring, who took his own life the night before his scheduled execution. The Nuremberg Principles established that obedience to orders was not a defense for participation in atrocities, a precedent that would echo through the decades in tribunals for Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and beyond. Adolf Eichmann, who had escaped to Argentina after the war, was captured by Israeli Mossad agents in 1960, tried in Jerusalem in a globally televised proceeding, and executed in 1962, the only civil execution ever carried out in Israel. From the ashes of the Holocaust emerged not only new legal frameworks, but a transformed moral vocabulary. The United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted in December 1948, drew directly from the horrors that the lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide, had spent years documenting and advocating against. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted the same month, articulated a vision of inherent human dignity that was, in many ways, a direct response to the systematic dehumanization that had made the Holocaust possible. Memorials and museums, from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, From the Stolperstein brass cobblestones embedded in European sidewalks to the preserved ruins of Auschwitz, Birkenau serve as both tombs and classrooms, holding space for grief and for education. Survivors themselves became some of the most powerful voices for remembrance and moral responsibility. Elie Wiesel, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, spent decades warning against indifference. "The opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference," he told audiences around the world. His testimony, alongside those of thousands of others, recorded through projects like the USC Shoah Foundation, established by Steven Spielberg after filming Schindler's List, ensures that the voices of witnesses endure even as the generation that lived through the events passes from the world. As of the mid-2020s, the youngest survivors are in their late 80s and 90s, lending an urgent, almost sacred quality to the work of recording their memories before silence claims them entirely. The Holocaust remains not merely a historical event, but an open wound in human civilization, a reminder that ideology, when fused with state power and public complicity, can transform neighbors into executioners and nations into killing machines. Every generation inherits the obligation not simply to remember what happened, but to understand how it happened, and to recognize the warning signs, the dehumanizing language, the erosion of rights, the willingness to look away that precede catastrophe. And so, as the curtain falls on this dark chapter of history, we are left with a chilling truth. When Adolf Hitler turned the machinery of a nation toward the eradication of the Jews between 1933 and 1945, the world witnessed how ideology, when fused with power and silence, can become catastrophe. Names like Anne Frank, Oskar Schindler, and millions more known and unknown echo through time as reminders that behind statistics were lives, dreams, and voices cut short. As the historian Elie Wiesel once warned, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference." May we remember, question, and never look away, because history does not only live in the past, it waits in the choices we make today. Goodbye.